In this video, we're going to navigate our way with the Bible GPS method through Leviticus 19 from verse 9 to 14. And we know that the Bible GPS method comprises of three major steps. The first one is the process of understanding. It takes us to the message to the original receiver. And then the next process is the process of application. Is that message still applicable to us? And then the third process is where we use creative ways to communicate that message if it is still applicable to us in the 21st century. So let us start with the first step, which is the process of understanding. And we use the acronym of START. Now the S of START is the situation. Always good to understand the background of a passage, because then you will have a better understanding of the message. Now the situation in this passage is where Moses gave the Israelites a set of instructions, and that was the covenant stipulations for them, because God made a covenant with the Israelites to make this shaky relationship more steadfast. And all these regulations, they were stipulations how to be obedient to this covenant. So Moses gave the law and the set of instructions for the people as well. What's the type of literature? We know it's not a narrative. We know it's not gospel. It's not wisdom literature. It is the law. It is law material. And now we have the S and T covered, and that takes us into the passage. So the S and T, it helps us to approach the passage. So we know we're not going to read it as a narrative. We're going to read it as a law material. When it comes to the analysis of the law, you will see it's not that difficult, because when it comes to the law, the message is many times explicit. It's not like the narrative where the message is implied. It is explicit when you read the law. So what I normally do when I zoom in, I determine whether this passage is ceremonial, civil, or moral law. And when you read from verse 9 to 14, you will see that it's mostly moral law. In verse 9, you will see, when you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. That was to allow the poor people to come later and to pick it up so that they could also have food. So one can say there's a good moral principle behind it to care for people, but we know that people don't do it today like that. So one can say it was probably part of their cultural practice, but there's a good moral principle behind it. But from verse 10 through to verse 14, you will see it's mainly moral law. It has to do with relationship. In the previous video, we saw that when it comes to the contents of the law, we have three categories. It is moral, civil, or ceremonial. And this is mostly moral law. But when it comes to the style of the law, we can have two categories. It is casuistic or apodictic. When it's casuistic, you look for words like when or if. And this is what I do when I get to 3.2, mark the main themes. I'm looking for those kind of keywords, when, if, or do not. So when you see in verse 1, it starts with when. So it focuses on a specific situation, and that is casuistic law, because a casuistic law is about a specific case, when. But in verse 10, or even in verse 9, you get in the second part, do not harvest the grain. So the word do not I underline. Also in verse 10, do not strip away. You have it in verse 11, 12, 13, 14. You get many times do not. And that I know when I have the word do not. When I have the words do not, I know it is apodictic law, because it is a demonstration of what's wrong. So it's very explicit. So one can say the first line, when you harvest the crops, it reminds us of a casuistic law, because it's a specific situation, but the rest will be apodictic. When I mark the law material words, I'm looking for those keywords, when, do not. Then I realize, because this is either apodictic or casuistic. But in terms of contents, I know that this is mainly a moral law, because there's no sacrifices of animals, therefore it's not ceremonial. So when I spend time and I mark the words do not do certain things, then I zoom out and I try to summarize all the explicit things that they need to do. And I try to summarize it in my own words. And I've come up with a message to the original receiver on page 105, and I want to read it for you. God asks them to act in good manner in all spheres of life. It is therefore clear that everything in our lives involves God. The reality is that no human being can please God consistently. They ought to be humble to appreciate how unworthy they were to belong to God. So when you read the book of Leviticus, you also see another word there that repeats 152 times. That's the word holy. And holy can mean to be healthy. It can mean to be set apart. And they were set apart to be different than all the other nations, so that when they follow the stipulations of the covenant, it needed to show the other nations that the Israelites are different because they are God's chosen people. So we spent most of the time in the A, that's the analysis of the passage. I'm looking for the whens and the ifs and the do nots, because it helps me to see what is the instructions there, because it's explicit. And when it comes to style, I know it's either casuistic when it's when or if, or apodictic when it's do not. But in terms of contents, I know it's mainly a moral law. Then we go out of the passage, then we go to the R and T, the relationship to the rest of the Bible and the test of your findings. So the relationship to the rest of the Bible, we need to see, does this message relate to the rest of the Bible? And I have a few passages there that shows us that it does relate to the rest of the Bible. Romans 3:23 says that we all fall short to the glory of God, because the law wants to reveal that we cannot save ourselves. We fall short. And then 1 Peter 1 verse 14 to 16 relates very much to this passage. And I would like to read it for us. 1 Peter 1 from verse 14. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do, for it is written, be holy because I am holy. And that's a quote from Leviticus 11 verse 44 and verse 45. Be holy, be different, be healthy, be whole, because you need to be different than the other nations. So one can see that this message relates to the rest of the Bible. And just to make 100% sure, you can test your findings by reading Bible commentaries or study Bibles. Then I promise you, you can check the yes box. We are on the right track. And this brings us to our next step, which is application. Is this message still applicable to us in the 21st century? How do we determine that? We look for the 3 laws and the 1 cultural practice. We know that only the moral laws are applicable to us. So we see that this message is a moral law because it's universal guidelines. It is essential. It was essential for them, and it's also essential for us because it is a moral law. It reveals the heart of God, the nature of God, as well as God's will. It's not a civil law. There are no bylaws. It's not a ceremonial law. There are no sacrifices. They need to bring no blood of animals. It's not really a cultural practice. It's all about good morals, good stipulations that you need to follow. And then the process of communication, we use creative ways to communicate it. But when you read the law material, you realize, you know what? As Romans 3 verse 23 says, I fall short to the glory of God. But the law points me to Jesus Christ because Jesus fulfilled the law completely. But God wants me to be authentic. God wants me to be humble, to acknowledge when I transgress and know that God's grace is always there for me. I trust that you got a better understanding of how to apply the GPS method to the law material. You see, it's not that difficult because it is very explicit when it comes to what one needs to do. All that you need to ask yourself, is this message applicable to us or not? And that's not that difficult to determine. Thank you, and keep on reading the good material of the Bible.